the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas's Educator Summer Professional Development. Hi, I'm Allison Clark, Exhibit Specialist at the Dallas Fed. For those who have joined our PD programs in the past summers, we welcome you back virtually. For those that are joining for the first time, welcome. Teachers truly are the heart of Texas and our economy, and we are excited to support you by providing video sessions from our expert economists, economic education advisors, and external speakers in our summer series. Thank you for choosing to join us for your summer PD. We know you have many choices, and we are glad you are here with us today. Whether you pre-registered or not, you will have the opportunity to earn continuing professional education credit after watching the video and completing the survey. The summer series will be available for CPE credit from June 22nd through August 15th. Our summer series topics include COVID-19 and the economy, which features our own expert economists. You will also hear from our regional economists with economic updates from Houston, El Paso, San Antonio, and Dallas. Lastly, you will also hear from our economic education advisors and external speakers on classroom resources and strategies that will expand your instructional toolkit for the upcoming year. The agenda for this session is on the slide. Remember, once you have finished the video, you will need to complete a survey and reflection questions to receive credit for the training. You can only receive credit once for each course. Today, you will hear from our presenter. At the end of the video, you will also be provided a link to complete an online survey and answer a few reflection questions. The survey should take around 5 minutes to complete. The survey is password protected. The password will be available at the end of the video. After you have submitted your survey, please allow up to 2 weeks to receive that certificate via email. Although we can't meet in person this year, we are here to provide you support for any questions you might have. Please feel free to reach out to anyone on our economic education team. Our contact information is available at the end of the video and on our website.
Our presenter today is Jason Saving. Jason is a public finance and regional economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. In this position, he conducts research on issues including tax reform, regional migration, income inequality, and the interplay between political polarization and fiscal policy. His articles have appeared in scholarly journals such as Economic Inquiry, Southern Economic Journal, and the National Tax Journal. Saving has also written policy-relevant articles on state and local fiscal issues that impact Texas and the 11th Federal Reserve District. Among the questions he has examined are why property taxes rose so rapidly in the years after the Great Recession, whether the poor bear a disproportionate share of the state's overall tax burden, and why Texas has a relatively low percentage of people covered by health insurance. A recurring theme of these articles is that public policy decisions have important consequences for equity and economic efficiency. Saving holds a BA in Mathematical Economic Analysis from Rice University and an MA and PhD degrees in economics from the California Institute of Technology.
Hello, I'm Jason Saving, a Communications and Outreach Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Thanks for listening and welcome to this virtual Econ Ed Summer Series presentation on what drives long-run growth in Texas. And we'll also be looking at whether there are some reasons to think that that long-run growth may have been affected by recent economic developments. I should start by saying that the views expressed in this presentation are my own. They do not necessarily reflect official positions of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. So, introduction to this presentation. Texas has consistently grown faster than the rest of the country. Typically, we grow about 1 percentage point faster than the rest of the country. There have been a lot of reasons that have been offered for this growth advantage. Among them are the state's reliance on oil and Texas' general tendency to avoid housing busts. Of course, right now, relying on oil is not a tailwind by any means, but nevertheless, these are reasons that people have given to try to explain this traditional growth advantage. But these short-run or structural factors that I'm talking about here can't really explain a long-run growth advantage that Texas might have over the rest of the country. Some other explanation is needed. So what are we going to be talking about today? First, we're going to discuss some key drivers of economic growth in Texas. Then we'll talk about whether state fiscal policy plays a role. Next, we'll talk about arguments for the channels through which a temporary economic setback, such as a hurricane, might affect long-run growth. And finally, are there any special implications for the state of Texas? So let's dive right in. Drivers of economic growth. Even before the 2012 to 19 economic expansion, Texas population was growing much faster than the rest of the country. 1.5% growth per year for Texas versus 0.9% for California, 0.7% for the US, 0.4% for poor New York. I'd also point out here that in every one of the 23 years that we're looking at, 1990 to 2012, Texas population growth led California, New York, and the US, illustrating that this really is a long-run phenomenon. So demographics are key for the state of Texas and growth in Texas. Why? Well, you probably know that immigration plays a big role from other countries, people coming into Texas seeking economic opportunity. But we also have a lot of migration from other states, like New York, like California. We have a higher than average birth rate here in the state of Texas. In fact, a majority of growth, population growth in the state of Texas, comes from natural increase, though some of those births are the children of immigrants. Now, these factors are both a challenge and an opportunity for the state, but mainly an opportunity, just as immigration and population growth always have been for the country for its 200 plus years of existence. Another factor that helps drive Texas economic growth is cheap and abundant housing. Texas is largely free from topographical features like, say, mountains or ocean that might impede development. We also have weak zoning laws overall in the state of Texas, which means that supply can grow at more or less a moment's notice. And this is a big difference between Texas and places like, say, San Francisco or Boston. Our housing supply being more flexible also means that we don't tend to have boom-bust housing cycles as far as price is concerned, like they do in cities like San Francisco or Boston. You can see in this chart, I have home prices, average home prices for the US in blue, Texas in red. If you take a look at 2001 to 2011, you see a very substantial housing price boom-bust cycle for the United States. But home prices remain basically flat in Texas throughout that period. This is normal and typical and expected for Texas home price behavior, while U.S. home prices zoom up or zoom down. However, between 2012 and 2019, you see Texas really participating in the national housing price boom in a way that would really not participated in the past. Does that mean that we're now attuned to U.S. housing busts as well? I don't know, and no one knows. But this chart provides interesting hints nevertheless. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention geography as being a key factor for the state's long-run growth. The state of Texas has the longest international border of any state in the country. Texas has also historically had a welcoming culture to immigrants and public policies that don't tend to disadvantage immigrants as much as the policies of some other states do. Now, it's true, as economic analysts such as Paul Krugman have said over the years, that Texas tends to have very robust low-wage job growth. But the state also has robust mid-wage and high-wage job growth. So looking forward, pronounced demographic change in the state, I'd certainly expect to continue, which raises the question, will tomorrow's workforce be a good fit for tomorrow's jobs? If not, that would suggest that we may not be able to maintain our traditional growth advantage over the rest of the country, at least not at the level that it's historically been. We'll see. It's also worth mentioning that there are significant challenges that Texas faces, like many other states, in the areas of infrastructure, health, others. The question is, can Texas find a way to meet these challenges without sacrificing the government's size, structure, business climate, etc., that, among other things, have helped Texas grow faster than the rest of the nation? And we'll talk more about that, well, right now. Texas is said to have leveraged the advantages that I mentioned in the previous slides with growth-friendly public policy choices. Other states have many of the same favorable traits that I've mentioned, like geography, like demographics, but most of them have not grown as rapidly. Business climate rankings generally place Texas at or near the top, often number 1 out of the 50 states, which is important, though there are important nuances that are worth mentioning in discussing state fiscal policy. Let's get into those now. If you think about the taxes that Texans pay, they fall broadly defined into 2 categories. Sales or consumption taxes, which represent about 50% of the taxes Texans pay. Here I'm thinking mainly of the state sales tax, which in most large cities would be a total of 8.25%. But I'm also thinking of the automobile tax and other things that aren't formally included in the state's general sales tax, but still are sales taxes in all but name. So in addition to that, just over 40% of the state and local taxes Texans pay are property taxes. School, city, county primarily, though there are other smaller property taxes that people in some parts of the state may pay, like a hospital tax or a community college district tax. So those types of taxes, sales and property put together, are almost all of the state and local taxes that Texans pay. Why would you want to tax sales? A couple of reasons. The main one is that sales and other consumption taxes have been found by economic researchers to be relatively efficient because they don't discourage saving and investment the way that some other taxes, such as income taxes, do. Sales taxes also provide a relatively stable revenue stream for the state. Contrast that with places like California and New York, where when the economy booms and, say, capital gains for the rich are growing at a huge rate, then they find themselves with huge budget surpluses. But when the economy tanks and personal income plunges, especially for the rich, then states that rely on progressive income taxes at the state level can really struggle. Whereas even during recessions, people have to eat, they have to live, they have to consume. So consumption tends to adjust much less than income, which is why sales taxes provide a more stable state revenue stream than, say, a state income tax would. However, it has been documented that the poor consume a larger percentage of their income than the rich do, which means that sales taxes may disproportionately burden the poor compared to the middle class or the rich, which is something to keep in mind when setting policy. Let's dig into that just a little bit further. In this chart, I'm showing you the percentage of an average person's income in each quintile that they would pay in taxes. So, for example, if you're in the highest income 20% of the population, then you might pay 2.8% of your income as property taxes. You'd pay an additional 2.2% in sales taxes, for, roughly speaking, a total state and local tax burden of 5% of your income. Now, look at the far left of the chart, the lowest 20% of earners. They pay on average just under 4% of their income in property taxes, but a little bit over 8.5% in sales taxes. So basically, the big slope of the blue line, high for low earners, low for high earners, tells you that the sales tax is quite regressive, disproportionately taxing the poor. Whereas the property tax turns out to be pretty close to a flat tax, hitting all parts of the income spectrum roughly equally in terms of the percentage of income paid. Oh, and I should mention here that in this data for property taxes, if you rent an apartment, then there's an imputation of the portion of your rent that would go to property taxes. So this would be counting for renters as well as for owners, that you'd have a positive property tax liability. Just wanted to say that in the interest of full disclosure. Now, it's true that if you instead look at per capita tax burden for Texas, for the nation, for California, for New York, what you find is that Texas tax burden per capita is about 15% below the national average, the line that's second from the left, far below California, and only about half the tax burden per capita of people who would be living in New York. So there's a very large difference in taxes paid by the average citizen of Texas compared to the average citizen of New York, even though Texas tax system is more regressive than these other states. Which leads to some questions that you might ask about inclusive economic growth. We know that the impact of policy challenges in health, education, other areas are borne disproportionately by the poor. Should this also be true of the tax burden, is a question that some have asked. But on the other hand, a more progressive state and local tax system might hit hardest those whose productivity is highest, potentially leading them to produce less or even move somewhere else. So there are potential economic consequences and a potential tension between equality and growth that is worth thinking about going forward. So that concludes the first two parts of this presentation, some long-run growth factors and a look at state fiscal policy issues and some of their implications. Let's now turn to the final part of the presentation, which is understanding how temporary economic phenomena could impact long-run growth. Let's stick to the U.S. for the moment. What I'm showing you here is yearly GDP growth for the U.S. from 1950 to the present in black, and a 5-year average of that same variable in red. What you can see is that back in the 50s and 60s, it was not at all uncommon to have growth of 4% or more for GDP growth. Even in the 80s, it happened from time to time. In this more recent era in which we now live, there's been a pronounced downshifting of growth, so that now, after the Great Recession, we're looking at growth 2.5%, so much slower than what we were used to experiencing in the 90s and before. Why is that? Why does it look like the economy's potential growth rate for GDP has slowed? Well, there are a number of reasons. Lower birth rates, as people have decided to have fewer children. Less immigration, for a variety of reasons that are not only related to public policy restrictions on immigration. Lower labor force participation among some age groups, like high school and college students, and also senior citizens. A cohort of older workers who lost their jobs in the Great Recession and struggled to retool afterward, with effects that continue to be felt today. And finally, having a productivity growth compared to the 1990s, 2% then, only 1% now. All of those things matter for the economy's potential growth rate. What can be done to raise it is the obvious question, which will then lead us into how a natural disaster or a pandemic could potentially have a lasting impact on growth. Well, we could raise the economy's potential growth rate through more births, more immigration, higher labor force participation among groups like high school students or the elderly, better retraining efforts or education efforts to help people of all types retool to make their skills more relevant for the modern workforce. The question that comes to mind then is, might a temporary economic shock of whatever type help or hinder any of these areas over the long run, even though the shock itself was only temporary? Let's talk about that. And I won't here be providing any figures for the current pandemic, won't be providing any analysis that is in any way intended to be applicable or descriptive or predictive of current monetary or fiscal policy. That would be beyond the scope of this presentation and beyond my remit to do. What I will be doing, though, is just providing a basic model to help, from our perspective as economic teachers, to how we would think about these types of issues. So let's start. When, say, a natural disaster would strike, the economy typically returns to its pre-disaster growth rate after an adjustment period. And if you'll forgive a walk down memory lane, I'll now be referencing the pieces of the presentation that led us to now. As discussed in some previous slides, the growth rate before the disaster is affected by labor force growth, by participation rates, as well as productivity growth. We've just talked about that in the last couple of minutes. As discussed much earlier in the presentation, Texas benefits disproportionately from trade, from immigration, from a relatively favorable business climate. And as discussed in sort of the middle of the presentation, Texas' tax system asks relatively more from the poor compared to other states. Key question: what will change that might affect some of those points, and therefore might affect economic growth after a temporary shock is gone, whether it be a hurricane or a disease or whatever it might be? Let's ask some questions that would be relevant to that. Will individuals quickly return to work? Or would the labor market in a situation like that play out like it did after the Great Recession, where many people really struggled to find work and watch their skills erode over time? Will restrictions on the movement of goods or services or people eventually return to where they were, say, during the 2012 to 19 expansion? Or would they be at least partially retained for the long haul? In particular, at times throughout history, when there's been an upsurge in globalization, and suddenly it becomes less clear that that upsurge will continue, this is not the first time by any means that's happened. Two questions that often come to mind are, will supply chains be permanently insourced to some degree? With the higher production costs such insourcing would entail, in order to protect against global supply chains suddenly being disrupted by a natural disaster, a pandemic, what have you. Also, will immigration fall in the wake of a natural disaster or a pandemic, or would that not happen? Specific implications for Texas. Texas is the nation's largest exporter, and we have been since 2002. That means that if there were to be permanently higher barriers to trade, Texas would be harmed disproportionately compared to the rest of the country. Because Texas, as we've discussed, is a leading destination for immigrants, Texas growth would be harmed disproportionately by increased barriers to immigration that might last long after a disaster or an epidemic were behind us. It's also worth mentioning that Texas is much more diverse than the average state. That suggests that were recent events to lead the state or the country to break down barriers that prevent traditionally disadvantaged groups from fully participating in the economy, it stands to reason that Texas would benefit from breaking down those barriers more than an average state would. Though to be sure, whenever any group in a population is inhibited from fully participating in the economy, then economic growth suffers because of that. Only time will tell which path we take, but the path we take will matter for our future growth and prosperity. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed Jason's presentation on fiscal policy and the impact on the Texas economy. If you'd like additional information and some presentations to utilize in your classroom this fall, please go to the Dallas Fed website, www.dallasfed.org. From there, I'm going to encourage you to go to our educator page where you see economic education and our resources. And from there, if you go to our classroom-ready presentations, there are two presentations that I think align well with the topics that Jason presented in his presentation. You'll notice they're under the Economics Bootcamp section. One is on fiscal policy, and you can see the TEKS that this aligns to, talking a little bit about types of taxes, the categories of expenditures, the impact of fiscal policy on the economy, and then the goals of growth. And the second one is economic instability. This talks a little bit about interpreting economic data, including our unemployment rate, GDP, GDP per capita, and measures of wealth, and analyzing business cycles, certainly relevant to the time period we're looking at now. If you have any questions, please reach out. We're happy to help you. Hope you have a great summer, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for joining our virtual PD session. Please use the link and survey password at the end of the video to complete a brief survey and reflection questions. In order to receive CPE credit, you will need to submit the survey after watching the video, which will arrive via email. Please allow up to 2 weeks to receive your CPE certificate. We look forward to hosting you at one of our 4 locations next year and continuing to support you with our virtual programs in the meantime. If you have any questions about today's presentation, please feel free to contact anyone on our economic education team. Thank you for joining us this summer.